All right, so in this video, guys, we are already experts on the New England colonies. They were formed because of lions and tigers and bears, oh my, religion and politics and business, oh my. And if you lived in one of these New England colonies, most likely you lived in a self-sufficient New England village. If you remember, self-sufficient means everything someone needs on a day-to-day basis is right there. You have the food you need because you're growing your own food. You have all the different businesses surrounding that open grassy area, the common. So if you need a tool made, you have the blacksmith right there. If you need clothing made, your tailor's right there. Everything someone needs in one of these villages is right there. That's very different than if you lived in a middle colony. The middle colonies were formed for a totally different reason. It was all about the formation of the colony of Pennsylvania and the Quakers moving to Pennsylvania and spreading throughout the middle colonies and spreading their Quaker attitude throughout the middle colonies. Come one, come all, everyone is welcome. And because the Quakers welcomed all religions came. People that move into a place are called immigrants. So immigrants moved into the middle colonies. They spent what little money they had left, many of them, to buy a small piece of land for a small farm. And they focused on growing just one crop, maybe apples or potatoes, or the most common crop grown was wheat. But because they needed more than just the crop they grow, they would travel to market towns. I remember market towns start with an M, middle colonies start with an M. And they would go there and trade with other farmers. They would use their crop and go to different businesses like the blacksmith and the cobbler and the cooper, and they would use their crop to get the goods and services that they needed. Today, we're going to focus on the southern colonies, and the southern colonies are very, very different. Number one, there's 5 of them. There were 4 New England colonies, 4 middle colonies, but there are 5 southern colonies: Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. And we actually already know a lot about one of the southern colonies. The very first of all the 13 colonies was a southern colony, and that was Virginia. And we learned the story of Jamestown. We learned that, after the first winter, they were so focused on finding gold, they never bothered to plant crops and half died. But eventually, Native Americans taught the people of Jamestown how to grow tobacco. And this became a huge success in Jamestown and helped start the colony of Virginia. Now, tobacco is something called a cash crop. That is by far probably one of the top 2 most important vocabulary words from this section. So let's talk about what a cash crop is. You've actually heard both of those words before. You probably know that cash is money and crop is a plant. So at first glance, you might think that a cash crop is a plant that grows money. That would be awesome, but it totally isn't true. Instead, guys, a cash crop is a crop, a plant, that is grown with the purpose of selling it to make money, not with the purpose of using it. So like I have a garden in my backyard and I grew tomatoes and peppers and cucumbers, and I grew those crops to eat. So those are not cash crops. But here in Jamestown, when they grew the tobacco, they didn't grow the tobacco to use it. They grew it to sell it and make money. That is why tobacco was considered a cash crop. And the southern colonies were all about a place for people to grow cash crops and sell and make money. So that was the main use of the southern colonies. And let's talk about what type of person would move to the southern colonies, would move to the Americas to get rich by growing cash crops. So I'm going to think this one through with you. What type of person would do this? Well, let's think this through a minute. The more cash crops you can grow, the more money you can make, right? That makes sense. And the bigger the farm, the more cash crops you could grow. So if you wanted to make more money from growing more cash crops, you would want to buy a large piece of land for a large, huge farm. We know what those huge farms are called. Think back to what we learned about the Spanish. They grew cash crops on huge farms as well. Those huge farms are called plantations. So when we talk about a plantation, we're just simply talking about a huge farm. So think about this for a minute. The bigger the farm, the more cash crops you can grow. The more cash crops you can grow, the more money you can make. So what type of person would you need to be able to buy this large piece of land for a plantation to begin with? Well, you'd need to have money. That's a wealthy person. And so really, it's the wealthy people, the ones with money, that would be buying land in the southern colonies to grow these cash crops to make money. Now, it only makes sense for wealthy people to start these plantations in the southern colonies. I'm going to show you why. This is not a made up word. It doesn't say, right? That's not what that says. These are actually the months of the year, if you look closely at them. January, February, March, April, May. I don't know if you can see that. January, February, March, April, May. What I'm going to show you is there's only one region here that makes any sense for people to buy land for plantations. Because the further north you are, the colder it is, the longer your winters are. In the New England colonies, May, June, July, and August, these are the only months of the year where it's good enough weather to grow crops. So we have a 4-month growing season in the New England colonies. That means only 4 months a year. If you try to grow cash crops, that you could grow anything. It means 8 months a year, your farm would be useless. That doesn't make any sense. In the middle colonies, our growing season, it's a little bit better from April to September. We have a 6-month growing season. So for 6 months, you could be growing cash crops, but that means 6 months your land would be worthless. But take a look at the southern colonies. The growing season in this warmer climate is so much longer, from February till November. 10 months a year, you could be growing cash crops. And sometimes on a good year, it could be all 12 months. So really, it only makes sense to be growing cash crops with the purpose of making money in the southern colonies. And that's why the plantations were found in the southern colonies, not in the middle and not in the New England colonies. So if we talk about how these colonies became colonies, we know Virginia, it was all about growing the cash crop tobacco. And the King of England was like, hey, this is great. We're making lots of money. We need more land to grow more tobacco. And so the king decided to start the colony of Maryland simply for more space to grow more tobacco. Maryland, named after Queen Mary, Maryland. Now, in 1663, King Charles II, the same king from the story of Pennsylvania, decided he needed more land to grow more cash crops. And so he actually started a whole other colony with all the land he had remaining. All that land from Virginia to La Florida became the colony of Carolina. And he actually named this colony after someone very important to him, himself, because Caroline means Charles in Latin. So he decided to name this big colony after himself, Carolina. And they needed to figure out what cash crop they could be growing to be making money in Carolina. Well, the obvious choice to try first, well, it was tobacco, because tobacco was working really well in Virginia and Maryland. Unfortunately, tobacco did not grow as well in the deep south, which is what this land was called. The climate was a little bit too warm. The soil wasn't great. So they tried some other things. They tried to grow silk. Silk was a valuable thing. It was one of the riches of the Indies, but growing silk didn't work. Silk was actually kind of a thread that was kind of pooped out of a silkworm, didn't really work here. They also tried to grow grapes, but that didn't work. They figured out that grapes really like cooler temperatures and different types of soil. So growing grapes in Carolina didn't work. They even tried growing cotton. Now, cotton, it turned out to be the perfect temperature and the perfect soil to grow cotton. But what you might not realize is cotton doesn't grow in a nice white fluffy ball. It actually grows more like this. And what you're seeing here is sharp, sticky seeds. And in order for cotton to be useful to make clothing or blankets, you would need to pull all those sharp, sticky seeds out by hand. And that was way too much time, and time is money. So even though cotton grew really well, it wasn't profitable. It wasn't a good money maker because it took so much time and so much money to get those sticky seeds out. And so after a lot of trial and error in Carolina, they finally figured out what did grow well and make a lot of money as a cash crop. And that was rice. Rice became the #1 cash crop in the deep South. But they also figured out how to grow something else down there that was actually a really good moneymaker. And that was this crop here. It was called indigo. And if you look, that color indigo of the petals, what they would do is they would take the indigo petals, they would grind them up with some water and create a beautiful indigo colored dye. and they would use that to dye clothing. And actually, indigo was kind of the color of royalty. If you think about kings and queens and the colors that they show, it is that beautiful indigo color. So rice and indigo became the top two main cash crops grown in the Deep South. Now, eventually, Carolina was divided up into the three colonies, North Carolina and South Carolina first. And then eventually in 1733, Georgia became the final and 13th colony, named after the King of England at the time, King George II. And so Carolina eventually got split up into North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Again, the main cash crop here was rice. The second most common cash crop down there in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia was indigo. We need a lot of workers on these plantations, and it may not surprise you based on what we talked about the Spanish and how they needed workers as well. These huge plantations required many workers, and the colonists chose to get workers to work on the plantations. They chose, again, to use slaves from Africa, just like the Spanish did. Now, not all plantations used slaves. Some of the smaller plantations, the families that bought the plantations did the work themselves. But on the bigger plantations, you might see just a few slaves on the plantations or anywhere up to 500 or more slaves on these plantations, helping to grow those cash crops. So what you need to know is the most grown cash crops in Maryland and Virginia, it was all about tobacco. But in the Deep South, North Carolina, South Carolina, and way down at the bottom there, Georgia, it was rice was number one and indigo was number two. So we're going to go ahead and fill in some notes very quickly here. All right, hopefully you have your notes out. If not, pause the video until you do. And here in the Southern colonies, it says many blank people moved to the Southern colonies and bought land to plant cash crops. Well, if you're going to have enough money to buy a big chunk of land, and that means you have to be wealthy. So the wealthy are moving down into the Southern colonies. Remember, our immigrants in the middle colonies, they were quite poor. They spent what little money they had on a small piece of land for a small farm. Here, the wealthy people would move to the Southern colonies. Blank, blank, crops grown to sell, not to use. 2 words, cash crops. Definitely need to know that. And again, the main cash crops in the Southern colonies, in Maryland and Virginia, it was all about tobacco. So go ahead and fill that in. And in the Deep South, there were 2 cash crops grown. One was rice. The other, that beautiful petal of the indigo color, the plant was called indigo. All right, so again, guys, our Southern colonies are all about growing cash crops on plantations. So the next video, you will be taking a closer look at what a plantation might look like.